The church was packed, lit by white flowers and laughter that overflowed with false cordiality. The altar awaited the bride and groom, but the guests' eyes were fixed on the back of the hall, where a young woman entered shyly, wearing a simple, worn dress inherited from her mother. There was no sheen of silk, no expensive lace, just the dignity of someone who dared to be there without ostentation. The women whispered, the men sneered. "Hasn't she any shame?" one of the bridesmaids murmured, laughing loud enough to echo. The embarrassment seemed to overwhelm her until suddenly a figure appeared in the doorway. A man in an impeccable suit, with a magnetic presence, walked toward her with firm steps. He wasn't there as an ordinary guest. He was about to change the course of the evening. Everyone expected to see her thrown out, pushed out like an intruder amidst so much luxury, but instead the man approached, looked her over from head to toe, and smiled respectfully. In a clear voice audible to all, he said, "It's funny. In a place full of expensive dresses and masked faces, the only true beauty is here." Silence fell over the church. The laughter ceased, the criticism stifled. He then took her hand firmly, as if not asking permission but imposing a new order. "She's not alone, she's with me." The logic of the scene shattered, and the planned humiliation turned into a spectacle of unexpected justice. If you felt the power of this story in these first moments, imagine what's yet to come. Every detail holds a twist. Every silence conceals a weight. Take the opportunity to like and subscribe to the channel so you can journey together to the end of this narrative where destiny always reveals its face. That wedding had been talked about for months in the small town. The families involved had prestige, wealth, and a pride that overflowed in every detail of the ceremony. The church had been transformed into a veritable stage of ostentation, columns covered in white flowers, chandeliers illuminating the central aisle, and a choir in tune rehearsing the notes that would guide the bride's entrance. The guests, in expensive attire, whispered among themselves, displaying jewelry and perfumes, as if the evening were a silent competition to see who would shine the brightest. Amidst this luxurious setting she emerged. She walked slowly, her steps marked by a mixture of nervousness and dignity. Her dress, simple and worn with time, clashed starkly with the lace, embroidery, and beading around it. There was no artificial shine, just light fabric, sewn by ancient hands. It was her mother's dress, the only heirloom she treasured. Her hair, tied back simply, revealed a beautiful face, lined with fatigue, but illuminated by a quiet strength. The first glances caught her eye as she entered the church. One of the bridesmaids raised an eyebrow in surprise before letting out a muffled laugh. "She had the nerve to come like that," she whispered to her friend next to her. The comment spread like wildfire, crossing the pews and reaching other guests. Some pretended to hide it, others laughed shamelessly. To them, that dress was an insult to the carefully prepared setting. But she didn't back down. She clutched a small pendant around her neck between her fingers, a gift from her mother, a symbol of all the struggles she'd faced up until that point. Each step toward the church was a challenge, as if the marble floor were covered in invisible thorns. I knew I didn't belong in that world of luxury, but I also knew I owed no one anything. The atmosphere, however, was becoming increasingly hostile. A group of young people laughed loudly without even trying to hide it. "You look like you've just come from a second-hand dance," one said. Another added, "This isn't marriage, it's a charity play." The words cut like blades, but she kept her gaze steady. Her heart was racing, her hands were sweating, but the decision to stay was stronger than any shame. The choir's soft music contrasted with the harsh comments. The air smelled of expensive roses, but to her it seemed tinged with contempt. She walked with the feeling of being an intruder, someone outside the script of the perfect evening. Yet with every step, she proved she didn't need approval to exist. In that instant, without anyone noticing, the church had ceased to be just the setting for a wedding. It had become the stage for an invisible battle. On one side, the cruel weight of appearances. On the other, the silent courage of a poor young woman who dared to occupy the same space as those who ridiculed her. And as the whispers echoed in ever louder waves, the atmosphere seemed to announce that something extraordinary was about to happen. something that would turn the night upside down. Long before she walked through the doors of that luxurious church, her life had already been marked by rejection and sacrifice. She was born in a modest, rickety wooden house in a forgotten neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. The roof leaked on rainy nights, and the winter cold crept in through cracks that could never be repaired. Her father had passed away early, leaving only the bitter memory of broken promises, and her overworked mother worked as a seamstress for neighbors, trying to make ends meet. As a child, the young woman learned to transform scraps into treasures. She played with dolls made of scraps and read books borrowed from the community library, imagining distant worlds different from the harsh routine that surrounded her. At school, she was often the target of laughter, simple clothes, repurposed notebooks, and a modest snack. Yet, she carried a quiet strength in her eyes, a kind of light that resisted the constant darkness. Adolescence brought more responsibilities than dreams. While other girls talked about parties and new dresses, she learned to care for her ailing mother and take on odd jobs, helping out at grocery stores, cleaning, houses handing out flyers on the streets. She never complained, but deep down she simply longed for a moment when she could be seen not for her lack, but for who she was. The dress she wore on that wedding night wasn't just a piece of clothing. It was a living memory of her mother, who had sewn it decades earlier for her own wedding. Stored in a wooden box, wrapped in a yellowing handkerchief, the simple fabric carried more than threads and stitches. It carried stories, tears, and hopes. When she decided to wear it, it wasn't for aesthetic reasons, but for honor. She knew she would be the target of stares and comments, but she also knew she was carrying with her the last embrace of the one who had given her the strength to face the world. Love, however, was never kind to her. She had liked a boy in her youth, someone who seemed to see her beyond her clothes and poverty. But when she discovered that his heart was more interested in status than true feelings, she realized that her life would often be a succession of closed doors. Even so, she never stopped believing in dignity. She learned to walk with what little she had, without bowing her head, even when the world seemed to laugh at her every step. And it was with this courage that night, she decided to enter the church wearing the dress that many would consider outdated, but which for her was a symbol of memory, resistance, and love. The past that shaped her was made of absences, pain, and difficult choices. But it was also the invisible fuel that pushed her forward, even when it seemed everyone was determined to push her down. And although no one knew it at that moment, that poor young woman with her simple dress and firm gaze was about to show that the greatest wealth is not measured in bank accounts, but in the silent strength of those who survived the impossible. The church bell rang softly, announcing that the ceremony was about to begin. The guests, already seated on wooden benches adorned with white ribbons and expensive flowers, whispered excitedly. The atmosphere exuded expensive perfume and rehearsed anticipation. Every detail seemed carefully planned to reinforce the grandeur of the families involved. However, the moment the hall door opened again, all eyes turned to a figure no one expected. She entered. The young woman, with uncertain but determined steps, walked across the red carpet. Her simple dress, inherited from her mother, contrasted like an open wound against the sea of silks, lace, and beading that paraded through the church. There was no artificial sparkle, just the sincere drape of an ancient fabric, shaped by stories and memories. The shock was immediate. The first murmur came from a woman in the second row. "My God, she had the nerve to come like that!" Others chuckled, some exchanged ironic glances. The bridesmaids, lined up in glittering dresses, commented in low voices, but loud enough to echo, "She looks like she just came out of a thrift store." The laughter was cruel, spreading like wildfire. She felt each word like a stone thrown at her dignity. Still, she didn't stop. She clutched tightly to the pendant around her neck, a memento of her mother, as if clinging to an amulet against collective contempt. Her heart beat fast, but her gaze remained straight ahead, not allowing tears to betray her pain. From the back of the church, some children pointed innocently, asking why her dress was so different. Their mothers, embarrassed, deflected the subject with a wry smile. The younger men exchanged sarcastically, and one whispered to his friend, "If she were my guest, I'd send her away right now." The mood shifted. The soft music filling the air seemed to lose its power in the face of the silent chorus of judgment. Her every step on the red carpet felt like a challenge, an act of resistance amidst the veiled laughter and raised eyebrows. For many, her presence was a mistake, an affront to the carefully constructed, luxurious setting. But there was something more. Amid the whispers and laughter, a few sympathetic glances emerged. An elderly woman near the altar watched the scene in silence, her eyes welling up, as if she saw in the young woman a reflection of her own struggle-filled youth. However, the power of these glances was small compared to the tide of contempt that flooded the room. She walked alone, and that detail hurt even more. Everyone around her was in pairs, families, friends, groups enjoying her solitude. It was as if the church, lit and decorated, had become a public judgment arena, where she was the star attraction. As he approached the front rows, the muffled laughter gave way to louder comments. She should have stayed home. How cheeky. This is a wedding, not a handout. Sharp, cruel words that echoed like invisible punches. But she kept going. Each step was a silent declaration of courage. There was no wealth, no jewelry, no designer dress. There was just her, poor, alone, but still standing. The collective contempt had begun, and everyone believed it would be just the beginning of an unforgettable humiliation. What no one imagined was that that very night would reveal a twist that would silence every laugh and transform that rejected young woman into the centerpiece of a story that would be forever etched in her memory. The click of her heels echoed across the red carpet like an uncomfortable reminder of her presence. Each step seemed heavier, not because of the simple dress she wore, but because of the invisible weight of the eyes following her. The wedding, which should have been a celebration, had become a silent courtroom, and she, without asking, was the defendant judged for the guilt of not fitting the expected standard. The initial muffled giggles became bolder. One of the bridesmaids, covered in rhinestones that glittered in the church's golden light, whispered loudly to her friend next to her, "Did she seriously have the nerve to come in a rag like that? She looks like Sunday mass clothes." The comment drew laughter, not only from the group but from others who heard it and pretended to cough to hide it. Opposite, a group of young guests made no effort to hide their mockery. One of them, cell phone in hand, leaned in to discreetly film. "This will get a good laugh later," he said quietly, but deliberately audible to anyone nearby. Another added, "It'll become a joke in all the messaging groups. Who knows? Maybe even a meme." The laughter was louder this time, piercing the room like poisoned arrows. She tightened her grip on the pendant around her neck, as if clinging to a last thread of courage. Her flushed face betrayed the pain, but her erect posture revealed a silent stubbornness. She wouldn't respond, wouldn't defend herself. She knew any word would be used against her. Silence was all she had left, and silence was sometimes more dignified than any explanation. However, the attacks didn't stop. A woman in a turquoise dress, apparently proud of being part of the elite present, commented in a clear voice, "Someone should warn that this is not a place for charity. This kind of scene spoils the brilliance of the ceremony." The groom, still at the altar, glanced briefly toward the commotion, but quickly looked away as if her presence were a minor inconvenience, unworthy of attention. For the young woman, every whisper was a stab in the back. The dress she wore, laden with memory and meaning, was seen only as ridiculous. What for her was a symbol of resistance and love, her mother's inheritance, was for others nothing more than worn fabric, a source of ridicule. Some of the more sensitive guests averted their eyes, unable to laugh, but also lacking the courage to defend her. Their silence was complicit, a burden as cruel as the sharp words that cut the air. After all, in that environment, it was safer to follow the current of contempt than to risk challenging the collective judgment. She kept walking, but with each step the hallway seemed longer, more suffocating. The choir's soft music became an ironic backdrop, as if mocking her rather than welcoming her. The stairs were like incandescent lamps burning into her skin, revealing every detail of her simple clothing, every poorly sewn stitch, every sign that she didn't belong there. It was impossible to deny. The confrontation had begun. It wasn't physical, but it was devastating. Laughter, comments, and whispers formed a wall against which she seemed too fragile to fight. But still she wouldn't stop. With every step she proved that, even if rejected, she wouldn't abandon the dignity of being there. The entire room believed the scene would end in pure humiliation. But no one knew that the logic of that night was about to be shattered in a devastating way, and that those confident laughs would be swallowed by a silence that would change everything. The church, already stifling with whispers and veiled laughter, plunged into a cruel atmosphere when the first outright laugh echoed shamelessly. It came from one of the groomsmen, seated in the third row, who commented loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Did she get the address wrong? This is a wedding, not a charity fair." The comment fell like a sentence, and laughter spread among the guests who had until then been pretending to hide their contempt. The young woman's heart raced, her face flushed even more, but her feet didn't stop. She walked down the red corridor with stubborn dignity, even though each step seemed to sink into the ground. But the collective laughter was gaining momentum. A group of young people sitting near the side made a point of clapping slowly, as if applauding her boldness in appearing there. "Bravo, a spectacle in poor taste," one of them said, drawing laughter from his companions. The bridesmaids, all in luxurious gowns, exchanged knowing glances and laughed subduedly but cruelly. One of them remarked sharply, "Does she really think she can mingle with us?" Another echoed this, even louder. "They should bar this kind of scene at the door. It's embarrassing for everyone." Even the priest, for a moment, seemed disconcerted, looking away from the entrance to the altar as if trying to ignore the weight of the situation. The choir's music, which should have brought solemnity, seemed ironic in the face of the spectacle of contempt that was unfolding. The young woman clutched the pendant around her neck so tightly it almost scarred her skin. It was her last anchor against the sea of humiliation that threatened to drown her, but the attacks didn't cease. An elegant woman in the front pew raised her voice. "This is a respectable family wedding, no place for beggars dressed as guests." The comment pierced the room like a poisoned arrow. The silence that followed was not one of disapproval, but of silent approval. In that instant, what had previously been mere whispers became a public judgment. She was no longer the target of whispered comments, but of direct attacks, unashamed of being overheard. Her simple dress, laden with memories, became a symbol of collective scorn. To everyone there, she was not a guest, but an exposed mistake. And yet, amidst that social massacre, her posture did not yield. Her face, marked by sadness, did not turn to tears before them. Pain burned within, but on the outside, there was only silence. A silence that, though interpreted as weakness, was, in fact, resistance. The guests believed they had won, that they had put this poor young woman in her place, crushing her under the weight of public humiliation. But unbeknownst to them, they were merely setting the stage for a scene that would shatter the logic of the evening and turn every laugh into an embarrassed silence. Because at that very moment, when the contempt seemed to reach its peak, firm footsteps echoed at the church entrance. A new presence was approaching, and with it, a turnaround no one dared imagine. The laughter echoed through the church like cruel thunder, reverberating off the walls covered in white flowers and stained glass windows. Each laugh felt like a nail being driven into her soul. The young woman, however, didn't allow her eyes to overflow before them. The tears were there, trapped at the edges of her gaze, but they refused to fall. And this gesture of self-control, though invisible to many, was the greatest proof of her strength. She clutched the pendant around her neck like an invisible shield. It was her mother's last gift, a symbol of love and dignity. That memory kept her standing, even when everything around her screamed for her to kneel and accept her shame. With each step, her simple dress swayed, betraying her humble origins, but also reaffirming the silent legacy of someone who never gave up on life, even without wealth. The guests were delighted with the spectacle. A bridesmaid commented loudly with a cold smile, If I were in her shoes, I'd be ashamed to appear like that." This comment drew mock applause from some young men, but to their surprise she didn't back down, she didn't turn away. He continued walking down the aisle, his head held high, as if he hadn't heard. And this silence, paradoxically, hurt more than if she had responded. Because her silence wasn't submission, it was resistance. It was the act of someone who, even wounded, wouldn't surrender her dignity to those who laughed. The entire church noticed she was suffering, but she wouldn't bow. And this stubbornness began to bother them. The collective scorn expected tears and flight but found steadfastness, expected defeat but found perseverance. An elderly gentleman sitting in the back row whispered to his wife, "That girl has guts. They'll regret laughing at her." The remark didn't reach the young woman's ears, but it represented a hidden spark in that sea of mockery. Someone saw what few others saw, the beauty of her quiet strength. As the whispers grew louder, the atmosphere became almost unbearable, but instead of breaking, the young woman seemed to grow stronger, not out of pride, but out of necessity. She knew that if she gave in now, everyone would win, and she wouldn't give that gift to those who despised her. Suddenly, the collective laughter began to fade, not because the cruelty had ceased, but because a new presence was approaching. The church door opened slowly, and firm footsteps echoed on the cold marble. The sound was different, charged with authority, and, little by little, everyone's gaze began to turn. Silence fell like a wave. The young woman hadn't realized it yet, lost in her internal battle, but everyone already knew. Something was about to change forever. The heavy church door creaked slowly, and a blast of cold air rushed in with the figure crossing the threshold. The guests, still laughing and whispering, glanced back, and what they saw plunged the hall into silence. A tall man in a perfectly tailored dark suit walked with firm strides. His face, serious and imposing, seemed to carry a natural authority that needed no introduction. The contrast was immediate. While the poor young woman was crushed by cruel gazes, he emerged as a presence that changed the logic of the entire space. He wasn't just a late guest, he wasn't someone ordinary. His erect posture, the discreet glint of the expensive watch on his wrist, and the confidence in every step clearly announced, this man was no ordinary man. The bridesmaids, who seconds before had been laughing mercilessly, stopped laughing and shifted uncomfortably in their designer dresses. The young men filming the event lowered their phones without realizing it, as if his presence had the power to expose their petty intentions. Even the bride and groom at the altar exchanged quick glances, unable to ignore the almost cinematic-like entrance. The young woman, still in the hallway, didn't notice right away. She continued to hold the pendant, her eyes fixed on the floor, trying to cut through the sea of contempt. It was only when she heard the steady sound of his footsteps echoing against the church's marble that she looked up. And upon seeing him, she froze. The millionaire paused for a moment, his eyes fixed on her. There was no judgment, no mockery. There was something deeper, a silent recognition, as if he saw more truth in that simple dress than in all the luxurious garments around. Then he shifted his gaze to the guests and, with an almost imperceptible movement, arched his eyebrow. He didn't need to say anything. The gesture alone caused many to lower their heads in shame. The murmur spread. Who is he? What is he doing here? Why are you looking at her like that? Whispered questions grew in volume, but no answer was clear. What everyone knew was that his presence had transformed the scene. The millionaire then resumed walking, slowly approaching the hallway where the young woman stood. His eyes never left hers, as if each step were a silent promise that the spectacle of humiliation would end there. And as he advanced, something shifted in the atmosphere. The collective contempt, once so self-assured, began to crumble. It was as if every cruel look was turned back on the one who had given it, as if the guest's own arrogance was being challenged by the man's silent authority. The night, which seemed destined to be remembered as the most painful moment of her life, was about to become the stage for a turnaround that no one would have dared to imagine. The church aisle seemed frozen the moment the millionaire stopped beside the young woman. The silence was so heavy that even the choir hesitated to continue the soft melody that filled the room. All eyes were fixed on him, waiting for the next scene. Some confident that his presence would only serve to reinforce the poor girl's humiliation, others intrigued by the mystery of that entrance so charged with authority. But what happened next shattered all expectations. He turned to the guests and in a clear, firm voice asked, "Is this how you celebrate love? By ridiculing someone for the dress they wear?" The question echoed like a sentence, cutting through the air and making many shift in their seats. The laughing young people lowered their eyes, embarrassed. The bridesmaids, who minutes before had been whispering and mocking, exchanged nervous glances. Then the millionaire extended his hand to the young woman without hesitation. "This is the truest dress tonight. It's not made of luxury but of courage, and that's what many of us here lack." The words fell like stones on the hearts of those who had been laughing until then. The young woman, confused, held the pendant around her neck and looked at him, unsure of how to react. But the gesture of offering her his hand in front of everyone wasn't just chivalry, it was a break from the cruel script they had written for her. He then turned back to the hall. "You hide behind expensive fabrics, but she presents herself as she is. That indeed demands respect." The church fell into an awkward silence, broken only by the distant echo of the guests' heavy breathing. The groom at the altar seemed torn between astonishment and indignation, unable to move. The young woman, still stunned, finally accepted his hand. The gesture was simple yet powerful. Her trembling fingers found the firmness of his hand, and in that instant she felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time. Protection. Not protection in the sense of dependence, but in the sense of being seen, of having someone who didn't treat her as invisible. The reactions were immediate. One of the bridesmaids whispered indignantly, "This is absurd. It's going to ruin the wedding." But other, more sensitive guests began to realize the depth of the scene. It wasn't just a defensive gesture, it was a complete reversal of the social logic that dominated that space. The millionaire stood firm, looking straight at those present, as if challenging them all at once. "If anyone here believes a dress defines value, then they're at the wrong wedding, because love isn't born of expensive fabrics, but of truth." The young woman took a deep breath, her hand still clasped in his. For the first time that night, the whispers and laughter had ceased. What remained was only the weight of a silence that acknowledged, albeit without admitting, that the humiliation had lost its power. And, in that unexpected gesture, the poor young woman stopped being the ridiculed intruder and became the center of a turnaround that would mark everyone forever. The silence following the millionaire's firm words felt like an invisible wall separating the before and after of that night. He remained beside the young woman, his hand still extended in support, while the guests, unable to react, exchanged looks of confusion and discomfort. No one understood why a man like him, accustomed to gala ballrooms and applauded in society columns, would stand so firmly by someone like her, a young woman in a simple dress rejected by the audience. But then came the revelation. He took a deep breath, facing not only the guests, but his own past. "You see her as an intruder, but I recognize her as someone far greater than all of you combined. This young woman is not just a poorly dressed guest. She is the daughter of the woman who once reached out to me when I had nothing." The murmur exploded in waves. People looked at each other, shocked. He continued, "Before you knew me as a millionaire, I was just a lost boy in this city, and it was her mother, a simple seamstress, who gave me my first suit for the interview that changed my life. If I have everything today, it's because a poor woman believed in me when no one else did." The young woman stared at him in disbelief. She hadn't known about the connection. To her, that dress was simply an inheritance from her mother, a memory of love and sacrifice. But to him, it was more. It was the living symbol of the origin of his own ascension. "I never forgot that night. I swore I would one day repay her, and when I saw her here, being ridiculed for wearing the same dress her mother sewed, I knew this was the moment." The whispers turned to absolute silence. Many lowered their heads, unable to bear the truth. That piece of fabric, which until just minutes ago had been a source of mockery, now became a symbol of memory, gratitude, and dignity. Still surprised, she reached for her chest, touching the pendant she carried. Her eyes filled with tears, but this time not of pain. They were tears of discovery. She discovered not only that her mother had left a legacy greater than she had imagined, but that her own worth could not be measured by appearances. The millionaire then turned to his guests again. "You humiliated her without realizing that her strength is greater than any fortune. And I say here, in front of everyone, this young woman does not need your approval, because she already carries the rarest wealth, courage and truth." The revelation not only changed the audience's perception, but also the course of the evening. The planned humiliation turned into unexpected exaltation. The simple dress was now revered, and the young woman, once rejected, was seen in a new light, the light of truth that no one there could extinguish. The church hall seemed paralyzed. The flowers, the lights, and even the sound of the choir had lost their power in the face of the millionaire's words. The dress that minutes before had been the object of scorn now carried another weight, the weight of memory, of gratitude, of revealed truth. The guests, until then safe in their whispers and laughter, felt the discomfort penetrate like a cold wind no one could ignore. The first reaction came in the form of an awkward silence. Those who had previously laughed now averted their eyes, staring at the floor or the stained glass windows, trying to escape the shame that engulfed them. The bridesmaids, adorned in designer dresses, exchanged nervous glances, laughter stuck in their throats. Some even tried to put on a serious face, as if they hadn't participated in the mockery minutes before, but it was too late. An elderly man, sitting in the back row, muttered loudly enough to be heard, "I saw what you did, and now you hide?" The phrase echoed like a collective judgment, and many heads lowered even further. Other guests began to comment, this time not against the young woman, but against those who had humiliated her. "It was a disgrace," a woman said sharply. "They laughed at someone who was simply honoring her mother. How cruel." The group of young people who had filmed the scene hurriedly put away their phones, their faces flushed with embarrassment. With each passing second, the feeling of being watched with contempt grew. The weight of social judgment now turned against them, like an unrelenting tide. Even the bride and groom at the altar were caught in the tension. The groom, uncomfortable, scratched the back of his neck, clearly regretting not having intervened sooner. The bride, her face tense, shot indignant glances at the bridesmaids who had led the chorus of mockery. The image of wedding perfection was beginning to crack, and blame fell on those who had turned a ceremony into a spectacle of cruelty. Meanwhile, the young woman remained silent, her hand still on her pendant, trying to process what she had just heard. Her heart pounded, not only because of the millionaire's revelation, but because for the first time she saw the masks fall before her. Those who had humiliated her were now the ones who were ashamed. Those who had laughed were now the targets of accusing looks. The millionaire, sensing the shift in the mood, didn't need to say anything else. His presence and words had already done enough. He simply stood firm beside her, like a guardian who, by revealing the truth, has seen the weight of judgment shift to where it truly belongs. And so the impact was inevitable. The poor young woman in her simple dress was no longer the ridiculed intruder. She was the mirror that revealed the hypocrisy of those present. And each guest, upon looking at her, was forced to face their own shame. The wedding, until then planned as a display of luxury and status, now became a scene marked by a moral lesson. There was no need for further words. The heavy silence, the lowered gazes, and the tense expressions said it all. That night, humiliation turned into silent justice, and all who ridiculed her would never forget the weight of that embarrassment. The millionaire stood firm beside the young woman, his hand still outstretched, his eyes fixed on the guests as if in silent judgment. But as he defended this woman rejected by the luxury that surrounded him, something inside him also began to change. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of the choices that had brought him to the top, and the emptiness that accompanied him even in the face of all the power he wielded. For a long time, he had believed that success was measured by the glitter of the events he attended, the value of the clothes he wore, and the reverence his presence commanded. But now, faced with a young woman wearing a simple dress sewn by an absent mother, He realized there was more truth in that worn fabric than in all the designer jackets hanging in his closet. As the guests lowered their eyes, he remembered himself at the beginning of his life. He remembered the closed doors, the veiled humiliations, the times he too was called nobody. The difference was that somewhere along the way, he had buried those memories under layers of vanity and ambition. And now, before her, it all came crashing back. Memories, pain, and the realization that he had distanced himself from the essence that had once driven him. He glanced discreetly at the young woman beside him. He saw in her eyes, still tearful, a strength that would not be extinguished. She had not responded to the attacks, had not lowered her head, had not fled. She simply remained standing, silently maintaining a dignity many in the audience would never know. This strength, raw and true, disarmed him more than any speech could. It was at that moment that he realized he wasn't just defending someone. He was defending himself, the boy who had once believed that character was worth more than status. The millionaire, so accustomed to being seen as a symbol of wealth, was beginning to discover a new kind of power, that of restoring dignity to those the world insisted on crushing. And the transformation didn't stop there. Deep in his chest, an unexpected feeling welled up. It wasn't just gratitude for his past with her mother, but genuine admiration for the woman before him. She didn't need jewelry or luxuries to command respect. Her silence was enough, the way she lifted her chin even amidst cruel laughter. This posture was nobler than any title. As he reflected, a certainty grew within him. That moment was no coincidence. It was a calling, not only to right an injustice committed that night, but to change the very way he viewed his life and his privileges. The millionaire who had entered the church was no longer the same man who now stood beside her. Before the curious and embarrassed eyes of the audience, he understood that he had found, in that poor and humiliated young woman, not only someone to protect, but a mirror that restored his lost truth. And silently, he promised himself that he would not let that story end in just one isolated gesture, because by her side, he discovered that the real transformation wasn't the audience's. It was his. The silence of the church still hung heavy in the air, broken only by the distant echo of held breaths. Everyone awaited the outcome of the scene, no longer as spectators laughing at an intruder, but as witnesses to something that transcended the logic of that marriage. The young woman, until then the target of collective scorn, now held in her hands the most powerful choice of the evening. The millionaire stood by her side, firm, offering his hand not only as a gesture of protection, but as an invitation to something greater. The public acknowledgement that she was worth more than all the judgmental gazes gathered in that room. His eyes begged for a response but didn't demand it. For the first time, someone powerful wasn't imposing a fate on her. They were, simply awaiting her decision. She looked at him, then at the altar, then at the crowd of faces that minutes before had torn her apart with laughter. He saw the discomfort of those who had mocked, now cowering in shame. He saw the belated regret of some, the concealed indignation of others. And above all, he felt the strength pulsing within her. It wasn't the dress, it wasn't the millionaire, it wasn't the audience. It was her. She clutched the pendant to her chest and took a deep breath. The memory of her mother flashed through her mind, along with all the nights of struggle, the days of sacrifice, the years when no one believed in her worth. For the first time, she saw herself not as a victim, but as the protagonist of her own story. The audience waited anxiously. Would she accept the millionaire's gesture, letting him lift her up in front of everyone, or would she refuse, reaffirming her independence? Every second of silence increased the tension, until finally, she spoke. "I thank you," she said in a firm voice, echoing off the flower-decorated walls. "I thank you for standing up for me when no one else had the courage, but I don't need saving. Because even alone, I already know my worth." The collective murmur was immediate. Some gasped, others looked at each other, unable to believe the young woman would reject what many would consider a golden opportunity. But she didn't hesitate. She slowly released his hand, without hostility, simply with the serenity of someone making a choice. "This dress is my story. I won't allow it to be remembered as the symbol of a night of humiliation, but as proof that I don't need anyone's approval to stay on my feet." Her eyes welled up, but not from weakness. They were tears of liberation. She turned toward the aisle and with firm steps began walking toward the church exit. The millionaire stood still, watching her, and in his gaze there was not frustration, but admiration. Because he understood, this young woman's true. Wealth lay in not allowing herself to be defined by rejection or help. The guests fell into absolute silence, their eyes following the woman who had entered as a target of ridicule and left as a symbol of dignity. There was no applause, no protests, just silence, the most eloquent of judgments. And so, in front of everyone, her decision was made, not to depend on anyone to validate who she was. The church door slowly closed, muffling the murmur that still echoed among the guests. The hallway, once a scene of cruel laughter and humiliation, now held only a dense silence that weighed heavily on everyone. Outside, night was already dawning, the sky tinged a deep blue, dotted with the first stars. The young woman walked alone along the cobblestone sidewalk, her simple dress swaying with her steps. The light wind made the fabric move like a silent flag of resistance. On her chest, the pendant shone with a soft reflection of the streetlights, as if the memory of her mother accompanied her on this journey. Inside the church, the guests remained motionless. No one dared resume the party. Every momentary laugh now felt like an open wound, impossible to erase. The millionaire, standing by the door, watched her silhouette retreat. He didn't call out to her, didn't try to stop her from leaving. He simply let her go, as if understanding that her strength needed not protection, but space to exist. A car drove slowly down the street, briefly illuminating her face, serene, still marked by pain, but sustained by a dignity no one could steal. Her teary eyes spoke not of defeat, but of liberation. For the first time, she didn't have to prove anything to anyone. And so, as the city resumed its ordinary routine, that night was etched in everyone's memory. Not for the flowers, nor the music, nor the union celebrated at the altar, but for the moment when a poor young woman, dressed in a simple dress, chose to walk out with her head held high before a crowd that tried to destroy her. Fate would still be written in the days to come, but in that moment, without words, without applause, and without explanation, the scene ended with a clear message. Some victories are not announced with shouts. They live in the silence of those who do not bend. If this story touched you, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments, what would you do in her place? See you next time.